Zdrasting. Ingo Badras. Weet ke barbank peme vor discussing martabari. Amaga. Continue la.
Nice slide, nice black.
Oh. All right. It's on Cherevi, good. Oh, another for Cherevi. Okay.
I'm an experimental.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. Okay, I think we're ready. Good morning, everyone, again. Welcome to the ARPA Institute 25th Anniversary Conference. We have an exciting schedule today. I'm sorry for the delay. We had a few technical difficulties, but I guess we resolved all the issues, so I think we can go on now. First of all, I'd like to welcome the dignitaries that are here today. Mr. Valery Magadumian, the Deputy Consul General of the Republic of Armenia in Los Angeles. Mr. Sinanian, the Glendale Councilman, and Reverend Revond, yes, representative of Archbishop Martirosyan. If I forgot anybody, I'm sorry. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. Our first speaker doesn't really need any introduction. He's a well-known personality and a legend in the engineering world, Professor Dr. Mihran Albabian. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences of Armenia and the United States. He's the first president of the American University of Armenia. He's a professor emeritus at USC, University of Southern California. And he has been with us for so many years. He's essentially my mentor. We organized the first Armenian National Congress in 1989 with Armenian Engineers and Scientists of America, and he was the general chair and the organizer. So without further ado, I'd like to invite him to say a few words. He's the general chair of the conference today.
Yeah, I can speak.
Mac.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have only a few friends here because we used to work together some years ago, and now, huh? No, oh, all right.
Go to the front, it's better.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go to the front.
Let me have it, Elizabeth.
I will take you to.
Yeah.
So we can also record it. It's
Yeah.
live streaming.
Oh, okay.
So,
Thank you.
okay,
This is it.
this is it.
Okay.
Pernem, yes?
Yeah.
Yes, I see Pernem.
Okay. Thank you again for the opportunity to join you. This is a very special group because of the activities that they have been involved in and also because of the fact that they have been working in the area where we have a great interest in what we're doing in the United States and also in other parts of the world, and of course in Mother Armenia. So I have a few words to read, because if I don't read, then I may talk too long. So let me say that it's a pleasure for me to join you, and we have had other connections, other activities together, but I must say that I have not been very active recently. As you can see with my situation, I have to sort of be careful about my health. And here I am, and I see a very good group of people who have been very active in our communication and the activities with Armenia. I have a few words that I'd like to read. I think that might be the kind of message that you already have heard from others, but nevertheless, let me read that to you. First of all, the general topic of today's conference is Armenians and Armenia in the 21st century, a strategy for long-term development. The specific areas to be covered are developing Armenia into a viable and sustainable economy, and to the social and political development of Armenia vis-à-vis the diaspora. First of all, let me say that the word ARPA stands for Analysis, Research, and Planning for Armenia. This year, ARPA is celebrating its 25th anniversary, as you know, and this is a very good opportunity to see each other again, because sometimes time goes by without activities. I will start by saying the earthquake in Armenia on December 7, 1988, had awakened the Armenians in the diaspora to become involved in Armenia's effort to recover from the effect of the catastrophe. And ARPA was among the group that got involved in the effort. At the same time, the United States National Academy of Sciences sent a small group of American scientists to Armenia to evaluate the possibilities of helping Armenia. The government of Armenia planned a program in science and technology for establishing what it called a knowledge-based economy for Armenia, giving the task for developing the program to the Ministry of Education and Science that included the Armenian National Academy of Sciences. The following list of topics became the basis of a program that was adopted. 1, identify the existing institutional capacity. 2, determine the higher education capacity and trends. 3, funding source. And 4, factors hindering development. That of course, is something that always has to be remembered as a possibility. Innovations in education and industry, and opportunities for scientific collaboration. These were the items that were included in getting involved in a need to support and help Armenia. Now, I must say that ARPA has been active in examining scientific and economic technological issues that indeed are important in the continuing development of Armenia. I think you all know about it because you are part of it. And in the diaspora, there was a major awakening of scientists, economists, and builders to help Armenia for an economic restructuring. And I'm sure that most of you will remember that in 1991, a symposium was organized in Los Angeles named The Economic Restructuring of Armenia that was held in Los Angeles. Some of the participants there are here in this room today. Well, let me stop here because there is so much to do here and so much to say. I congratulate Hagop Panosyan, the president, and the members of ARPA for having the vision and for implementing a program to achieve the goals of developing projects needed for a long-term development of Armenia. So I will look forward to listening to the others who are all more active than I have been. In the last few years, I've been less active than I was before, but I think that what I have done before has helped me create situations where I have met many of you, and I'm very happy for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihran. Thank you very much. It's really an honor to have someone like Mihran speak to us, since he's been active all his life, and so we've learned a lot from him. Now, I'd like to say a few words here. First of all, we are live streaming, which means everyone can see it from their computer, and we would like to ask you to please follow us on the internet and tell your friends to follow us. Even outside the United States, everybody who has internet can follow us and see what is happening in here. And so please ask everyone to follow and be part of it. Our next speaker is also a well-known person, Dr. Yervan Zoryan. As you all know, he's the president of Synopsys Armenia and the chief architect of Synopsys USA. So he has been involved in technological activities in Armenia for years, and also he's a community leader. He has actually started a very important program of online learning of Armenian and Armenian history and Armenian culture through the AGBU. He's of course on the board of the AGBU, and so he's a person that everybody knows. He's going to tell us today about the technological, information technology research and development in Armenia. After Yervan, we're going to have the chair of the session one, and we're going to introduce her later. So, Yervan, please.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be with you. I just arrived from San Jose this morning to make sure that I participate in this important event along with you. My talk today is about Armenia and Armenians in a certain sector, that's the IT domain. As you know, information technology is something that surrounds us all. What I'll try to do is I'll try to talk a little bit about the trends in this domain, what's happening, and what is the role of Armenia in doing that, what has been and is the role of Armenians at large in making all of that happen. And in my mind, I divide that into multiple phases. We'll go through them together, and we'll look at future opportunities as well. And if you have questions, please feel free to stop me or keep them at the end. You have the choice either way, okay? We all know that we are involved in an era surrounded by technology for everyone, everywhere, and in everything. So technology is becoming more and more prominent around us in all kinds of equipment. Even though the applications may differ in those equipments, but the backbone behind them is the technology sector, that is especially the IT domain, the hardware and the software. Whether we use them in our cars, whether we use them at home, whether we use them in our pockets, they all have hardware and software base. These days, we are surrounded by lots of data. And data is the key element in all what we do today. And it's today's oil, if you want to. Because the more data one has, the more wealthy one becomes. And these days, the large companies compete on collecting huge amount of data, processing that data, manipulating it, accessing it, securing it, storing it, transporting it, and so on. All what we do in technology is dealing with huge amounts of data. And that's why most of the equipments that we deal with are equipments that are handling data today. The smallest equipments, from our watches all the way to our TVs, they all handle 2 ways of data. In fact, in a single minute, there are 2 million searches on Google that take place, including us, but not now. We have lots of YouTube hours that are being loaded, again, every minute. You see, many things are happening in a given minute, including 350 gigabytes of data being uploaded on Facebook given a minute. So all of that is impacting us in multiple ways. For that, we need to ensure that that traffic of data is running properly. And that traffic of data needs different equipment and need proper IT, in which we can be either users or it can be users and creators and developers. And today we're dealing more and more with the development aspect of it. Many equipments have converged together. In your pockets, you have a piece of equipment that has numerous functions. As we know, that convergence of making smart equipment has already happened some time ago. And we have, whether they are computers, our phones, our tablets, they are converged equipment. However, we're moving to a new era now, and we'll be part of that, all of us. And that is a third circle. The first circle is something we had it for a long time. That's our mainframe, our big computers, the cloud, if you want to, the servers. The second circle is the portable stuff, the mobile equipments that we have, whether they're our laptops, our phones, and so on. And both of which are multi-purpose. They help us in many purposes. The third circle is this thing called the Internet of Things. That includes many, many pieces of small equipments that were not smart at the time, were not connected at the time, now are becoming smart and connected. From our toys to our keys to our small cameras, being connected and being smart is a new way of doing that. And what's happening is that this third circle is communicating with the mobile equipment, which is communicating with the cloud, and that data is being transferred from layer 1 to 2 to 3 and back. So there's lots of opportunity for doing new things for all of us in this domain. So the Internet of Things will bring billions and billions of new intelligent elements around us to help us. Today we already see lots of wearables, lots of fitness-oriented, health-oriented, some safety or security-oriented equipment, some smart city or commerce-oriented ones. The most important of which for me is the automobile. The automobile is also one of those Internet of Things. It is becoming connected as well, and it's becoming more and more intelligent to do things. It's already driving by itself in various ways, at least on the highways, parking itself, and so on. So we every week receive new upgrades of software with new features being added to the same piece of hardware. Those cars are huge supercomputers. They have over 100 million lines of code on them. And they transfer over 4 terabytes of data every day. Again, data being collected throughout the day, and at the same time being transferred up and down the connection. So 4 terabytes of data is a huge amount there as well. Now, all of this sits on a number of systems that are sitting in the cars, and that making us see a big growth. Why I'm talking about the cars? Because today they are the fastest growing sector in the technology domain, including the semiconductors that are the chips that are sitting behind it, and the software that's sitting behind it. So it's not anymore the mobile phones or the tablets. It's not anymore the games being the largest growth element. Now about 25% annual growth is applied for the next 5 years to automotive technology, to automotive chips, subsystems, and systems. Like anything else, there are 3 elements to this. There are the OEMs, which are the car makers, okay? The tier 1s, who are building the blocks for the cars, and then the components, which are the chips sitting behind them. And all of that intelligence sits in this component domain and helps the tier 1 and the OEMs to do their job. So the requirements typically start from the car makers, go to the subsystems, and go to the chips. And the chips themselves are growing very fast, as you see here. Within the next few years, we'll be in $58 billion business, just the semiconductors in a given car, which will be over 500 chips sitting in a single car. Now, to create all of that, we have an infrastructure. We have an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is growing as we move. It's not a single company that will do that. Today, we have over 30 companies that are doing chips for cars, and there are many, many companies doing the software behind it. Now, still, the Silicon Valley is the center for all of this. Most of the research going on for autonomous cars goes on in Silicon Valley. Even the Mercedes, the BMWs, and so on have their R&D in this specific domain in Silicon Valley. As we saw before in social media, as we saw before that in mobile equipment and so on, Silicon Valley remains an attractive. However, we are seeing also lots of diversification going on. Today, Israel, for instance, in this automotive domain, is very, very active. There are numerous startups in this domain of automotive, and here you see the growth, at least in Israel, in this domain. And we hope to see that same thing going on elsewhere also. That links us to where we want to come, to Armenia. So how can Armenia play a role in this? While there is a center, but there's also distributed system. We are very well connected, and developing a technology will not be done in one place only. Armenia itself, throughout history, has always been not a big nation, in the middle of the traffic. It has collaborated with others, so collaboration is in our genes, it's in our DNA. We learned languages for a long time. We have been peaceful. We never built huge empires. We have been collaborative in general, and we strive for prosperity and success, at least individually, if not as a country. Now, for that, what we need to do, we need to be innovators to be able to be there. And today, we have that in our genes, and we can contribute to humanity at large. For that, during the last century, we already saw that technology is one of the important sectors in Armenia. During the Soviet era, STEM education, science, technology, engineering and math were important at that time and still are. We have seen intensive R&D during that era. We saw close relationship between Armenia and its surrounding other Soviet republics. During that era, we have seen numerous institutions being created. We have seen the Mergelian Institute being created. We have seen Yerevan State University starting its own informatics department, the engineering school the same way. So all of the key institutions, whether it is the Polytechnic Institute, YSU, or the Academy of Sciences, have built their engines for that. And the scope of their activities were not simply education. They did research. They also did engineering development in Armenia in multiple domains. In the IT sector, we had computer science, engineering, design and test of semiconductors, software engineering, information. At the same time, diaspora was also very active in engineering. So there's a long list of contributors to technology in diaspora that went on. Now, I will not concentrate on the older eras. I'd like to come to the newer era. And the newer era, since independence, in my mind, divided to 3 phases. The first decade, the second, and now we are in the third decade. And we saw different characteristics, how things are moving forward. And I'll try to take you through these 3 decades to come to today to see what are the challenges, what are the initiatives, and what kind of solutions we have or we need more from all of us. So if I go to the phase 1, that phase one is the first decade after independence. That was a period to rescue the scientists, to rescue the technologists in Armenia, because they were disappearing. They were moving out. Like many other sectors, the Armenian technologists were also at risk for leaving the area. That time, the diaspora was quite active, similar to Professor Albabian, Professor Derguderian, who went from diaspora and established educational programs. Similarly, we had diasporans who went also established strong programs in other aspects as well in technology. So we had donors who came, such as ANSEF, NFSAT, AGBU donated again to maintain the people in Armenia. They provided grants from several sources. We had started to see certain Russian grants as well coming in as military industry work. Now, all of that resulted in leveraging the human capital. We were lucky to have lots of supplies, and we started to build the demand at that stage. And that investment was very helpful because it absorbed the existing talent. And not a large number left Armenia in that case. Most of them stayed, so the departing portion was very small. I was lucky at that time to work with Professor Albabian and Derguderian in building in AUA a lab to be able to maintain a good number of researchers in the area of semiconductor design and test. That microelectronics domain ended up to be quite successful. Some of those people who maintained at the time, we started with 30 people. Today, they're all placed in the industry, and we'll speak about that in a bit. One of the positive outcomes was to prepare that team and to bring in certain companies. So in this phase one, we did not have big multinationals. We had companies that were private, made by diasporas, who took the risk of going to Armenia and starting small R&D operations. HPL was the first that we took in 94, LEDA in 95, Virage in 99, and so on. APG Labs by Sam in 98. So we had a number of companies starting in that decade, building themselves and doing private development, not public companies yet, but very effective R&D. Most of them are Silicon Valley companies that were represented in Armenia, like we do in India or in China. In this case, was using Armenian human capital to do that. And we did very good comparative studies showing what the Armenian human capital would do in this case, what the Armenian experts would do, compared to what India or China or Romania could provide. Now, that success resulted to a phase two. And that phase two started to show us steady growth in this sector. And as a result, multinationals started coming in and acquiring some of those smaller companies that we created, some of these private companies that we created. So we had successful R&D as an outcome, and we started to see more and more hiring, and I'll show you soon the numbers, how that growth in numbers happened, demographics. But the R&D was successful, and the multinationals started to appear. So those multinationals, one of them was Synopsys, which I happen to be a part of today. Synopsys, we came there in 2005, first acquisition, and since then we acquired 4 companies between 5 and 10, and the totality was companies in Silicon Valley being acquired but having R&D in Armenia. Following Synopsys in 2007 or 8, National Instruments came in, then Credence came in, then VMware came in about 10 years back. So we started to see a good number of well-known names coming in this second decade. So I'll stop for a second to talk about the Synopsys experience to give you a view of what would a company, a multinational company of a certain size do. Synopsys today is a $2.5 billion company with 12,000 and some employees. I would say about 80% of them are in R&D, are engineers, and 20% none. Large number of masters and PhDs among them. So this is the corporation at large. And what it does, it contributes to the chip design and test industry. It contributes to the microelectronics. In fact, it's the #1 that provides tools to build chips worldwide. Now, dealing with these new dimensions, the angstroms that we're dealing with, the silicon that we're building, and also the software that is running on the silicon itself. But this company, like many others, is built on acquisitions. This shows you, it's very small to see from your distance, it shows you the number of acquisitions that Synopsys went through acquiring companies. Among those, over 100 companies, many of which were acquired after each one of them acquired multiple other companies. So if you look at the grandchildren, it will be over 400 companies that are absorbed into this corporation. Now, in those, there were several that were in Armenia. As I mentioned before, 4 companies which happened to have R&D locations in Armenia get absorbed into this. So what we did with that, we started to see locations all around the world, but Armenia being quite large. So I'm proud to say that Synopsys, in this case, has the largest international location outside the US in Armenia, even though we are in over 35 countries, but the largest location happens to be in Armenia. And these happen to be the buildings. We have 4 buildings next to each other in a campus where the Synopsys campus is. It is a Silicon Valley company located there. As an example, what we started to see the impact of Armenian engineers on the products. And about 10% of the engineering workforce happen to be in Armenia today, working on very advanced products as such. A total of 750 people working in Armenia as employees, and a number of contractors, interns, teachers, and so on. We have about 1,000 people that are on the payroll. Now, the Armenian activities are in high-end technology. Today, we are dealing with 10 nanometer and 7 nanometer designs. If you are in the semiconductor domain, you would know that these are the high-end domains. Now, in this same period, in the phase 2, where companies like Synopsys came to Armenia, we started to see interest by the government. The government showed some nice interest. Even though in the phase 1, they had no interest at all, it was totally transparent to them. In phase 2, we started to see that the Prime Minister established a council with the industry and academia. We started to see acceptance in various aspects. For instance, Synopsys introduced this GIT award, Global Information Technology Award, that the President of Armenia hands every year. We had another one for students in the IT domain in universities, undergraduate and graduate, that again the President provides this award every year. It is sponsored, supported by Synopsys in this case. We have established this annual Microelectronics Olympiad. We have established this congress called ARMTech Congress. Several of you have participated in the past, which happens to be a private-public partnership. So several things happened during this decade, this phase 2, that were very impressive. Here we see the Microelectronics Olympiad in Armenia, where 25 countries do participate in it from around the world. They come to get the competition and the awards in Armenia. Now, phase 3, where we are today. Phase 3 takes us to a situation where we have numbers that grew. So if I look at the numbers here, I see that, for instance, as business, in 2004, we had about $37 million business coming out of this sector. And how many people were working at that time? We had about 3,000 people working in 2004. Today, that 3,000 people is 15,000 people. So we had 5 times growth in terms of number of contributors, the human capital, the experts, which is very good growth. We also see that in GDP, now we are far more than what we used to be. We used to be about 1%. In the most recent statistics, we're close to 5%. It's 4.7% out of the GDP of Armenia, this sector, which is also good. However, we can also notice that the students who are participating in this are not growing in the same ratio. The number of students in this domain have been growing in a much smaller ratio. So what we had in 2004 today has doubled, but not became 5 times more. And that brings us to an important challenge in these human capital aspects in Armenia. That is, while we have good growth, while we have a good ratio, in fact, one of the highest ratios of female participation in the IT industry is in Armenia. About 1/3 of the employees are female versus male. this shows the number of companies as they grew over time, from 2-3 companies in the early 90s that I was mentioning, to about 400, over 400 companies today in Armenia in the IT domain. I will not go to their subdivision, the topics they're working, but you can see that the majority of the companies are less than 25 people. We have many, many startups, whereas only few are over 100 people. After Synopsys, the next company is about 200 people, and then the rest are smaller. Now, foreign companies still contribute about 1/3 of this business, and 2/3 now became companies from Armenia, that is, owned by Armenia contributors. So foreign ownership is mostly US, but also some from Europe, from Russia as well. And we see that the technologists are key elements among those. Those multinationals today in this phase 3 are continuing. We're seeing more multinationals coming in. In this past few years, we see Oracle, we saw Cisco, we saw Mentor Graphics, and so on coming in. But more importantly for me, in this third phase, in this third decade, we started to see many startups in Armenia that are turning international, that are coming to Silicon Valley, becoming stronger, becoming major international contributors to the domain, which we didn't see in the past. In phase 1, phase 2, we did have companies from Armenia, but they were serving the local market only. Today, we have them contributing to the bigger market. Some of those names may be familiar to you. PixArt is one of them in image processing. Jumag, doing electronic publications for over 100,000 users, that is customers using it. Shadowmatic in the game domain, among the top games today. Zanki, an equivalent to Uber if you want, in that region. SoloLearn is a very nice one, again, that teaches software as an app. Volterman is a smart wallet company. Alupa is doing augmented reality with VR equipment. Teamable is, again, social media, a nice way of recruiting top talents by connecting people that you know to each other. Now, these are some samples of companies that are, it's not comprehensive, but a nice sample that shows how a small company in Armenia came out and now they are in the international market with a very good presence. They are all in the IT domain and they're all contributing to this sector. So they're among those 15,000 people that we know of. And there are many behind them. So this creativity and entrepreneurship that we know of have combined together under this umbrella and gave us the necessary. Now, it's not enough to have the creativity only. You also need the funding, as we all know. So now we have started to see accelerators coming in to provide the funding, to provide the incubation. EIF was the earliest in this. We have Granatus Fund, which is providing an early and mid-range funding. We have Hive Fund, which is doing early. FAST, which is the newest among those, it will take care of multi-stage startups, if you want, from early stage and on in terms of investment. A very interesting, very important contribution there as well. So we see a number of supporters who are coming and supporting the creators, the creativity. Now looking forward. What do we see as looking forward? The Armenian economy itself is growing. You can look at the numbers yourself. I will not cover the entire economy. But this sector is among them. However, we have challenges. The first challenge, which is for me the most important, it is the imbalance between supply and demand. Where in the first phase we had more supply than demand. We have more people that were working versus positions. In the second phase they were balanced, but now that's not the case anymore. There is much more demand than the number of experts that we are supplying through the universities or the ones who exist already. So that imbalance is a problem to all of us, quantity-wise. Quality-wise as well. So quality-wise, we are also suffering. Many of those companies now are starting to have their own partnerships with universities in order to provide the necessary educational boost and have people who can contribute to their sector in terms of R&D. The third challenge that I see in this is that even though we have this 15,000 people today, and hopefully will become 45,000 in a few years, the ratio of
real R&D, the ratio of research and development versus doing basic coding, doing website development, and so on, which are the lower level IT contributions, if you want. The real research and development is only a small fraction of that entirety. So what we like to see is we like to see that number grow, the total number, but as well the ratio of R&D as a ratio grow as well, because the real gain is in the R&D, is not the basic things that can be done anywhere else as well. I mentioned boosting education. One of those is Synopsys has its own educational department working with 5 universities. National Instruments is working with the Polytechnic Institute under the ANEL umbrella. Mentor Graphics and many others are working with AUA. AUA provides very good value there as well. So we see that companies with education are working nicely with each other. An example of this, I'll show you what we are doing Synopsys-wise. So we have a model where we're working with 5 universities, and we provide the curriculum as well as we help with the instructors. Part of the instructors come from the company, the other half comes from the university system, and together they provide the bachelor, master's degree. Also, we have a good chunk of PhDs that go under that. So these 5 university numbers are growing. We started with Polytechnic Institute. The numbers were not sufficient. We expanded that. We have much more than that today. If I look at this, about 50% of the graduates of our program are being hired by Synopsys. The rest of the rest, that is the other 50%, are being hired by other companies in Armenia. We have 100% jobs for all of those in their field of education. And also the PhDs are fully in this domain. We know that sometimes the retention is not very good for PhDs when they start and finish. In this case, we do have, so far we had 51 PhDs out of our program. All of them have completed their jobs properly. Now, this program that we established is not limited to Armenia. It's interesting to know that over 700 universities in the world are using the program that we established in Armenia for our own employees. So today, there are many, many nice logos that have adopted this curriculum, adopted the courses, the labs, and the tools that come with, and use it outside. So it's not only the products that are being used, but you see there are lots of parts of this program, 720 universities in 58 countries using it today. Besides that, we also provide training courses for our own employees, but not limited to Armenia. There are 2 locations in India, in Russia, in Poland are using our training courses. So again, Armenia is teaching or providing training to the employees outside Armenia. So that shows our role towards outside as well. Also to contribute beyond the company, we provide lots of publications in conferences, in journals, many, many patents that come from our Armenian employees. So all of that is again given to the world outside. So this is just one example to show you where we're going with this. Now today, there are a few new initiatives, just on closing. One new initiative in education on the university level is from AUA. The computer science program of AUA has been boosted recently, as you know, by having the undergraduate program coming in, a very strong department that is providing also the graduate aspect of it. So a nice boost of the computer science program will be very helpful to this industry. For me, this is one of the key initiatives. Another key initiative is the Polytechnic Institute has just announced its Technology Institute by combining 3 departments together, turn it into a full institute just last week. So that will also contribute a lot by their labs and their professors. TUMO has started this Convergence Center. Will start, actually. It's a very good project. In fact, yesterday there was a presentation on it at TUMO. Yesterday, Friday, that is, yes. And there's another concept of new technology university that is also cooking. So there are multiple initiatives, and I encourage all of them because we need the quantity and we need the quality. This is the AUA Akian School. We also have a number of other initiatives for not university level, but on the school level. So for school level, you all know perhaps that we have this after-school program in TUMO. We have robotics clubs, multiple of them. We have summer camps for math, STEM at large. We do have also several schools that have strong STEM programs, such as AIP, the Diligence School, Quant, Shiragati, and so on. So there are many of those that are coming in. We also have the AGBU Armenian Virtual College entering into this aspect as well, based on the government's request to provide e-learning for STEM topics to come. We have this Araradian Baccalaureate, which is again school-level program. Finally, one very interesting school program that we were part of starting along with the Minister of Education, Vivacel, and Unicomp. This initiative is to go to the high schools, to the last 3 years of the high schools, and to provide IT courses. Similar to what we saw in chess, as you all know, in the elementary schools, we have 4 years of chess courses. So this will be IT courses at the high school level. These are some of the institutions that I just mentioned. This is the Armenian Virtual College being taught, the AIP School, the Diligence School, with strong STEM programs. So this program that I mentioned that Synopsys is part of is sponsored by Synopsys, Vivacel, and Unicomp for the last 3 years. That is 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So they teach information technology, basic communication, and microelectronics. So all 3 of those would come initially. The first year that we started, we did it in 5 schools, and we are expanding it. This year we have additional 6 schools, and they are not limited to Yerevan. They are covering the regions as well. And the intent with the Minister of Education is to expand it further and to encourage technology education from early stage so that the flow to the universities is of better quantity and better quality. So here are some numbers. If you're interested, I'll be happy to go over with you later. So we expect to see much more results coming from this program as we expand it every year. So we'll be adding 5 schools or 6 schools every year throughout Armenia. Contributing to the country is important. We see very good appreciation. These are some of the awards that Synopsys happen to have received for their contribution. So opportunities are many around us. There are lots of new things that are coming that are based on IT as a backbone, whether they are drones or automotive technology, whether there are smart cities or smart factories. I think we can do a lot by encouraging and engaging with our counterparts in Armenia. In fact, I see that every Armenian has a role to play in this. Everybody in his domain of expertise can go and try to encourage technology creation, development, and startups in that domain as necessary. So I think we are in this ICT domain. We have a lot to prosper and success in the coming years. Thank you.
Time for questions. Does anyone have any questions? We have time for a couple of questions. Any questions? Yes, in the back. Yes, Cynthia. Please, the speaker. Where's the microphone?
Yes, I have seen that done in Armenia. So offshore program software development is quite common. So we have it in 2 different ways. Some of those multinationals that I've shown, they actually do programming there, but they don't do only coding. They do R&D as well. Okay? So you do the research behind it, and then you develop the code, the software. That's one aspect. There's another, which is just contracting software development. And we have various firms in Armenia, small firms, that find out different contracts, and they participate in those contracts. So we have many engineers who directly do the coding for companies who are in the US. So yes, contracted coding is possible. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Yes.
You talked about the imbalance between supply and demand when it comes to
Yes.
human capital.
Yes.
Is migration one of the reasons for that?
Not much. The migration in this sector is not much. I know from our companies we do have some migration. Some individuals would like to go and work for Google, for IBM and elsewhere sometimes, but that percentage is very small, I would say. It is less than 4%. 4% will be the maximum that I would see, okay, compared to other sectors. So it is not the migration. It is the job creation is much bigger. In fact, there are many companies who would come to Armenia if we have supplies, but we don't, and that's limiting us. Even for the existing companies, we don't have enough individuals who can fill the open positions. Yes?
Speaking of international companies, especially from Silicon Valley, what does it take to entice or even lobby the multinational, the Intels, the Googles, the Facebooks of the world to establish a small location in Armenia, or maybe even compete with someone like Synopsys in Armenia? Could we have some sort of a lobby that goes and markets the Synopsys model into the Silicon Valley companies to
Yes.
bring people over?
Actually, we have done that quite a lot in past years. We participate not only Synopsys, the other companies also that have success stories. We participate in different shows in Silicon Valley and elsewhere to entice companies to come. But the companies that you mentioned, okay, those large companies, do not come for small locations. They all have many locations around the world. Some of those names that you mentioned, I personally was involved in inviting them to Armenia. They came, they liked, but they want at least 5,000 people to hire. And given our numbers that you see here and our population at large, for a company to come and hire 5,000 people, it will be impossible to maintain the balance.
Could I have a follow-up?
one more question, and that's it.
Yes, please.
I've never been accused of needing a PA system. What do you see as the infrastructure and political hurdles that stand in the way of the expansion that you're talking about? Specific infrastructure and political hurdles.
Yes. The infrastructure side of it. Today we don't have infrastructure problems yet, but if we truly double our number of students in universities in this domain, we will have trouble because we don't have enough space, enough professors, and so on. So scaling is an issue eventually. But for now, we can scale. At this point, we are not increasing. We are keeping a steady number in universities, which is not good because the industry is growing and the university production is steady. Now, political side, I don't see issues there. In fact, the country likes this, would like to encourage having more companies. So if there is anything to be done there, they would contribute. But I don't think there's too much to be contributed from a politics point of view.
Okay, thank you, Yervan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
By the way, we have, as I said before, live streaming. And you go to Facebook and say ARPA Institute, you'll find it. Also, hashtag ARPA, you can find it. So please follow and please tell your friends to follow us. And I forgot to mention one of our other legends that is here today, and we're honored to have him. Of course, Professor Richard Hovhannisyan, who everybody knows. Thank you for being here. And so our sessions will start right now. And before I start the session, I'd like to also say that we are very thankful to Aram Dermardirosyan, who's sitting there, who's doing the live streaming for us free of charge. Thank you, Aram. Our session chair for the Developing Armenia into a Viable and Sustainable Economy is Ms. Carla Garabedian, Dr. Carla Garabedian. She's, as you know, a filmmaker, famous filmmaker, and also she has been a producer in the Promise movie, and everybody knows her, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce her and come into the podium.
Thank you, and thank you for asking me to be part of this event today. In another life, I was Dr. Garabedian. I still am Dr. Garabedian, but I don't use that title very often. And I had a degree in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where we had to do economics because economics and politics were considered to be two sides of the same coin. And this organization, in the topics we're going to be discussing today, they see those issues as being symbiotically intertwined. And that last question we had about what are the hurdles to infrastructure in Armenia, that gives you a clue about some of the issues we're going to be discussing in this session. This session, Developing Armenia into a Viable and Sustainable Economy, we have 3 speakers, and I'd like to invite them onto the stage now. They are Dr. Banayan, King Banayan, would you come to the stage? Dr. David Jofayan and Dr. Tatul Manaserian, would you all come to the stage? Thank you. And Dr. Jofayan had us worried that he'd get here on time. He's actually flown in from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. And he's flying back today as well, so we're grateful to him. Very grateful, thank you. And what we're going to do is we're going to have 20 minutes for each speaker, and then we're going to have 2 discussants who will speak for approximately 15 minutes, picking up some of the issues from the issues raised, and then we are also going to have a panel discussion where all of you can ask your questions. So please note down your questions so that we can include them in the panel discussion afterwards. If I could invite first, just as a short introduction, Dr. Banayan, who is the Dean of the School of Public Affairs at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, where he's also professor in the Department of Economics. And he knows our part of the world well because he holds a PhD in economics from Claremont Graduate School. He's the author of 2 books and more than 40 articles on monetary policy and political economy. And he's also served as a consultant to central banks and governments in several developing countries, including Armenia. He's a senior fellow of the Center of the American Experiment in Minneapolis, and he was a state representative in the Minnesota House between 2011 and 2013. And just to show how multifaceted he is, he has his own radio show, The King Banayan Show, which broadcasts out of Minneapolis, St. Paul. Please welcome Dr. King Banayan.
That one does not work. Okay. Does this have our presentations on it as well? Is this the right laptop that we put them on? No, it's not. Okay. Have you come get this? The other laptop that was here before is right there. Okay. So it's going to be terrible for the people trying to stream, but so that we don't lose time, I'll try to start without the slides, and then we'll just jump in when everything's ready. First of all, thank you very much to Hookup and ARPA. I was a member of the board back in the early 90s during one of my tours at Claremont as a grad student and then as a visiting professor. And at that time, got involved in a project that worked in Eastern Europe, not Armenia, and from that time then got to know Hagop and our friends at ARPA, also later on the Armenian International Policy Research Group, AIPRG. So I've done a fair amount of work in Armenia, and when Hagop calls me and says, would you please present a paper, I'm now, as Carla pointed out, I'm now a dean. I don't get to do papers anymore. They now make me an administrator. So my job, it seldom has me do something like this, but this is a chance for an old dean to let his hair down a little bit, relive past glories, and talk about some of the things that we worked on back then, and now with 25 years in the rearview mirror, and hopefully many, many more to come. To think about where we are, where we might be going, and maybe to add a touch of realism to where it is that we would hope to be. I'll just wait till you guys have this thing hooked up. So this is actually a presentation that differs substantially from the paper that you'll see in the proceedings, because it's actually two papers. I'm just going to keep wandering away from these guys so that they don't run me over. This paper started as a paper that was sort of in the traditional economics mold of okay, let's look at the economic freedom measures, let's look at GDP per capita, let's look at the Human Development Index, all those things. And there's some of that in my paper when you read the proceedings, because I felt like that's what I had told Hagop he would get as a paper, and I felt obligated to put it there. But as I went through working on this paper, I've had in the back of my head the thought that someday I'm going to do a book about development and transition. And I thought, well, why the heck not now? Why not get started on that project now? So thanks for the opportunity, Hagop. You actually gave me a jump start to some work that I've really wanted to do. The work in this paper is work that sort of looks at two different, or actually maybe three different branches of research and tries to twine them together, only some of which are truly sort of traditional economics of the kind you might have learned at LSE or I learned at Claremont. One of those strands is the strands that talks about borderland studies and borderland economies. I want to talk to you about Armenia today in terms of being a borderland, of a small country situated between two regional powers that wish to have more power and wish to exert influence on other parts, on their near neighbors. And in that sense, the paper is comparative. It actually compares Armenia to its other nearby neighbors, its neighbors being, in this case, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Two of them have relationships where it's Russia versus the EU, and in two of them, and in one of the cases, it's certainly Russia versus Turkey plus Azerbaijan. Georgia is in there, but because it has a borderland feel to it, even though it has a more unique history relative to the other three. The third strand of research that I bring into this is to think about the fact that, excuse me, I've only told you one, so I should tell you the second. The second one is the research that was done by the late Mansur Olson, who I had the pleasure of knowing. He was a professor at the University of Maryland in the economics department. I thought he was really quite wonderful. They're still working on this. And Mansur Olson's work later on, and died way too young in the year 2000 at the age of 66. Mansur Olson's work later on was on transition in Armenia, and particularly looking at his book Power and Growth. And the thought that in what he does in this book, in this research that characterized the last 10 years of his life, is describe countries as being run by, first, when they're very, very new, run by a group of roving bandits. Basically sultans and khans and so on, roaming the countryside, pillaging and taking stuff and then running away. Eventually, he says, one of those sultans or khans or emirs or emperors or what have you, one of them becomes the ruler and says, you know what? If I stay here, things will be better. I'll stay here, but I'll stay here and I'll control and I'll be able to part of the wealth of this area for a lot longer. And if I can do that, it'll be better for me. But that means that they now have an interest in investing in the place that they're ruling over. They become what Olson called a stationary bandit. In my view of what's happened in Armenia has been sort of this trade between between different stationary bandits. And it's a horrible word, I admit. It's not my word, it was Mansur's word. But the word bandit is just a way to describe someone, a governing group that wishes to extract resources for the benefit of the elite that gives it its power. The third piece, which is actually much more political science than it is economics, is the work of Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, who's done this work on something called a selectorate, a group of individuals who actually choose who are the leaders of a country. No, I don't need my flash drive. It's right here under economic. It's right there. You're looking in the wrong place. I think that's David's. Beautiful. Thank you so much. All right. All right, we're going to, I don't know how much time I have left or if I got graded on the curve there. I don't believe in grading on curves. Ask my students. But let me just run through this I'm going to run through the first few pieces then very quickly because I've already told you most of what's here. So most borderland studies look at borderlands purely as a geographic concept. Here in Southern California, it's the U.S.-Mexico border. That's the most common piece. It can be regions of the country, regions of one country or another. Think of Alsace-Lorraine, a region between France and Germany where the population speaks both languages fluently. It can have also huge political dimensions. And so I love this quote from the Georgian scholar Alexander Rondelli, who says, you know what, if you're a small borderland country near a major power and you make a mistake, it's not a luxury. It actually can be fatal to your future. And so if you think about borderlands, you can think about what borderlands look like here in Armenia, but if you look between Russia and the EU, you can see this borderland of Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. Georgia has long had aspirations to join the EU, so have Moldova and Ukraine, at least parts of them have, and a lot of the political fights in those countries turn in good part on whether or not they should join the EU. So as I think about the reasonableness of this particular viewpoint, there's the geopolitical viewpoints, and we know about those. We also know about the fact that shipping is very difficult. And one of the things I was speaking to one of the speakers you'll hear this afternoon about this, Russia is currently in a fairly weak state, but Russia has historically had this weakness that when it wishes to ship to the West, it has 3 choke points through which it has to pass all of its goods. It has to go through one of the seas in order to ship heavy goods across, and it means it's going to pass through countries that it doesn't have, that are not part of its borders. It has to pass them through a place that is sometimes rather hostile to them. Turkish opportunities to have major influence are also limited to the West, so they have strong interests in the Middle East. That's one of the reasons why you see Turkey being more active in Middle Eastern affairs than it had been 25 years ago, because there are limits to its ability to access markets elsewhere in Europe. So for these reasons, I'm suggesting that this is an interesting way to look at things. As an example to think about this, I'm just going to give you a map this map of Africa for a second. If you look at the populations of Africa and look at where the tribes lived and then look at where the boundaries are, the map on the left shows you though. All those blue areas are areas where a boundary passed between historically, ethnically homogeneous groups. If you look on the map on the right shows you the amount of conflict in those areas. Okay, conflict increases as that piece gets darker, and you can see there's a pretty strong correlation between those two maps. Places where you drew the boundary through an ethnic group, the more likely it was that that group was going to have ethnic ethnic strife. We think we can supply the same kind of story to the Caucasus and to Ukraine and even to Moldova. I think I've got a quickie map of Moldova here for you as well. And because I don't want to chew up all the time, let me just move past this. So each of these countries lies between two powers, and the whole story of the paper is really revolving around this idea. What kind of economic development can happen when you've got these neighbors near you? All right? How well can you develop your country? And so I say this because in Carla's introduction of giving you my biography, one of the things that's certainly true is I spent a lot of time working with projects where we were there talking about things that eventually got called the Washington Consensus. We didn't call them that when we were doing it. Okay, that name came later. But we were the kinds of folks who would go in and say, well, what you need is more economic freedom. You need more political freedom, as if they were dials that you could just turn. We ignored, in many cases, the context, the historical, ethnic context of the places in which we were working. And I do believe that one of the things you need to do if you're going to do this kind of research is to actually spend time thinking about the context and sort of ask, given where they are, what are the right structures that could develop? And that takes us, first of all, to a group of what I would consider stylized facts about Armenia. This is in the paper. It's probably kind of hard to read for those of you sitting in the back of the room. But basically, there's 3 stylized facts that we have about transition from the early stages of transition. One of the things we knew was the more integrated a republic was in the USSR, the more disruptive was the transition. Armenia had the misfortune of an earthquake in 1988, for which much of the relief effort came from Russia. So when transition happens in 1991, Armenia is more dependent on Russia than just about any other state in the republic inside the USSR. So it was likely that Armenia was going to have real problems with transition. Second, in terms of trade shocks would be worse for countries that had to import energy, since those imports would now trade in dollars rather than in rubles. Armenia, of course, was a heavy importer of energy, and so its terms of trade shocks would be large. I'll show you the pictures in a minute. We can run through those fairly quickly to get you to those. Lastly, countries closer to roving bandits, or I actually think I'm going to rewrite this to sort of say competing stationary bandits, would be exposed to greater risk, lower output, and higher spending on military to defend themselves. And as you'll see in the data, these countries, all 4 countries, spend a fairly high share of their human capital, of their labor force, and of their GDP on military spending. So as you look at these places, right? If you look at the amount of trade that was going on in 1989 before they started transition, no country had more trade with other republics than did Armenia. Disruption was likely to be greater here than elsewhere. If you look at energy imports, all right, the country's energy imports in 1990 were 120% of final consumption. That meant that some of it had passed through to other republics. Okay, and its per capita use was lower. Okay, the parentheses indicate the net exporters, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, Turkmenistan as well. You can see that kind of story applied equally well, I believe, to Georgia and Belarus and Moldova. It did not apply as much to Ukraine, but notice that Ukraine was a very high energy user because of its higher industrial base relative to the other countries. This had impact on the amount of trade that would happen. So here's the exports from Armenia in 1996. You can see that Russia was 50% of the destination, Georgia 22% of the destination. In this case, the story gets a lot better as you go forward into 2015, where you'll see that Russia and Georgia went from being 77% to about 22%. And that trade is now much more diversified across areas. But the point was, the shock was going to be larger. And as I mentioned before, the earthquake was likely to be larger as well. The fiscal transfers to Armenia in 1989, largely as a result of relief efforts for the earthquake, were 23.3% of GNP. And you go from that to 2 years later, the country sending you that money goes through this major, major disruption. It's hard to imagine how things could have gone much better. And that's kind of the theme I have, and I know that this will be something that we'll have a fair discussion about. Could we have done better? And I'm on the side of maybe not. Maybe it couldn't have gotten better than this. Let me show you one more piece. In the paper, I draw 4 figures, one for each country, that looks like this. This is only for Armenia. This goes back to 1960, and it takes data from the World Bank and traces out on a graph from 1960. So you want to start, as you look at this, let your eye look over to the right at 1960. The horizontal scale is population growth, the population growth rate in a year. The vertical scale is per capita GDP, adjusted for inflation and all that stuff that we economists love to do. You can see that it slides backward. The population growth rate was falling all that way, but you can see that the collapse, and you can see that by the time we get to 1980, growth in per capita GDP in Armenia came to a standstill. So they were in 10 years of no growth before transition. And then an earthquake happens, and then your benefactor friends in Moscow go through this cataclysm. You are likely to see what you see here. You see the collapse, you go over here to 1995 and you'll see that you'd had almost a halving of per capita GDP, and you had a shrinking population. You had the emigration from Armenia to go abroad. It then goes back around and starts to rise very slowly. By 2000, you're still 26% below where you were in 1990, 10 years later. But then it increases fairly rapidly, and then finally, and I find this was the most surprising thing I found in doing this paper, you actually had an increase, you started to see an increase in the size of the population beginning in 2010. That surprises me. And it's a story that I have not heard a whole lot about in terms of thinking about what's going on in Armenia today. And unlike the other 3 countries, and I don't have the time to show them to you, but they're in the paper when you get a chance to read it, you'll see that in fact, none of the other countries in the borderland states have had an increase in their population since transition. The rate of decline has slowed, but they're still in decline, even 25 years later. Last couple points to make here. The terms of trade negatively affected GDP. This is from an old paper from Dave Tarr at the World Bank. This is the size of the terms of trade shock that was found, and then the changes in GDP. You can see the size of the shocks. 7.8% of the decline that happened between 1990, or 7.8 percentage points of that decline actually came from the fact that the terms of trade had changed. Now, it was worse in Moldova, but compared to the other countries, it was not bad. And for Azerbaijan, it actually turned out to be a benefit to them to actually get off the ruble and go to the dollar. Terms of trade, though, turned positive. The top blue line, that is Armenia. The terms of trade turned positive for Armenia by 2001. The dram began to hold its own and actually slightly it was allowed to trade a little more freely. That's not quite the case currently if you look at what's happening right now, but certainly terms of trade have turned out better for them. To my last point that I made about what it takes when you live around these neighbors, take a look at the amount of spending that happens in the size of the number of people. So this is 84. That actually should be per thousand, total per thousand capita. That's in total, and if you look at active duty, you see the numbers there. The total force, the total number of people under arms in these countries is fairly high, but in terms of active duty, you can see none higher than Armenia. That is a point that I thought probably belonged at this conference, and tried to think about why. The impact of all that, for me, has been watching governments become more stable, more stationary, maybe stuck in a state that we would not call democracy. But one of the things that the Olson theory predicts is that as these rulers, this selectorate becomes more stationary, they will make the effort and they will invest to increase GDP, which we saw, and they will find a way to extract more resources from that population in order to improve the situation of the elites, the selectorate that has put them in place. And indeed, on this slide, you can see that that's happened. In terms of per capita tax revenues, Armenia has had an almost 900% gain since 1995. If you look at the only other country that's in its neighborhood is Georgia, but that's largely because the collapse of revenue collections in Georgia was just dramatic at that time. You can see even as a share of GDP, these numbers are now up to fairly substantial numbers. Armenia going from 16% of GDP to 28% of per capita GDP. So as you think about the development of a new country in this borderland area with strong neighbors who don't particularly have your interest at heart, one of the things to think about is the fact that it's difficult for you to really invest a whole lot in creating a wonderful IT sector or something else when you worry that the neighbors near you might come take those resources from you. Maybe not by taking over your country, but by encouraging some way of gathering transfers through terrible arrangements like the Eurasian Union that we were speaking about last night, and things like that. There are many ways in which resources can be transferred back to the people outside. Economic reforms are less likely when the reforms are likely to be less long-term. And that is the fundamental point that this makes in this. So this paper doesn't have as much of the theory that I've been discussing between Olson and Bueno de Mesquita in this, but you can see that it has some elements of it. And so what I consider the paper to be at right now is a sketch of where I think the economy has been and where it will go. It just says that the geography of the USSR matters. There's no reason to believe that Armenia would be another Estonia or something like that. It just doesn't make sense. They're very different geopolitical situations. Neither could it be another Kazakhstan for similar reasons. Armenia was going to be like itself. The closest comparisons would be these other borderland countries. It has some commonalities, particularly with Georgia and Moldova, less so with Ukraine because Ukraine's so much bigger. But you can see that they're the same. So thank you for the opportunity. Here's the research that will come from this, what my plans are to do this. And thank you for letting Nadine let his hair down and talk a little research for 20 minutes or so. Thank you.
So I'm sure you'll have some reactions to that. Note them down so that in our panel discussion you can raise some of the questions. Our next speaker, who I told you has flown in from Washington, D.C. today, Dr. David Julfayan. He is an economist at the Office of Tax Policy at the U.S. Department of Treasury. He's also an adjunct professor of economics at Georgetown University. He's worked on diverse areas of economics and public policy. His research has included the behavioral effects of taxes. He's also looked at entrepreneurship, philanthropy, intergenerational transfers, savings, labor, and work effort, and a lot of other topics. He's published in a number of important journals, which are listed in your various materials there, and he's taught at Georgetown University, George Washington University, Middlebury College, and Yerevan State University. He briefly served as a U.S. Treasury Technical Advisor at the Ministry of Finance in Slovakia and the Ministry of Finance in Armenia. And he received his PhD in economics from Northeastern University. And he's the co-founder of the Armenian Economic Association. David Jolfayan is going to be talking to us about Armenia's prolonged transition. That's my emphasis, prolonged.
Again, I want to repeat what the rest have said. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I think last time I did this was 5 years ago, and it's hard to say no to Hagop. First time I met him was in Yerevan. I was at the Armenian Economic Association, and lo and behold, he shows up. So, but also it turns out that if we go way, way, way back when probably I was this tall, we may have run across one another, but I can't tell. What I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about what Armenia is going through, expand on the reasons that it may be going through, and suggest some thoughts on what the next steps are. But before I do that, perhaps I want to start from the end. For years, like many of you, I followed the works of Professor Hovhannisyan and others, where they take bits of data from our past, 100 years ago, thousands of years ago, build articles, books around them, and educate us and inform us. It's hard work because often you have to dig up this information to be able to do a story about it. So when we look at Armenia today, the country is awash with data. You can get data on just about anything you want. What people typically eat, you know, how many abortions they have, how many computers they have access to, what their education is, how many children they have, how many of them are sick, how many of them are working in Russia. I can go on and on. They have census data, household survey data. How much research we see on Armenia, how many publications, with the exception of one or two perhaps associated with international organizations, one or two perhaps at the American University, zero. We don't have research done that appears in any of the top publications. Tier 1 top publications, Tier 2, Tier 3, I could go down the list. Okay. But Professor Hovhannisyan is hard work. Do research on Armenia should not be. Now, all of us have these great ideas what we want to do with this country, but what do we base our thoughts on? I see all these great ideas coming from Yerevan. Let's complain about this, let's complain about that. I'm sure that the diaspora have a lot of wonderful ideas, but what is the research to back it? What do we base our information on? What motivates us to take on the next step? Anyway, that's the lecture part. Let's move on to the substance. Okay. So when we look at Armenia, again, working backward is a bit difficult, but one reason it's difficult is that I got here at 1 o'clock in the morning, realized I didn't have my USB drive for the PowerPoint presentation, spent a few hours going over the paper I'd emailed Hagop and trying to recreate the PowerPoint, and then run to Target, buy USB drive, and create all this. But anyway, hopefully I'm all together. So what you had in 91 is a major shock. Armenia transitioned to a modern economy, a new economy. And you had shocks after shocks. The bigger shocks are the blockades, the war. One thing we don't pay attention to is that one of the key difficulties Armenia faced is that because it's of the solution of the Soviet Union, Armenia, it's true, lost its markets and all that. But the border next door with Turkey could have given it access to all the Western amenities, all the Western technologies. For those of you who've flown to Yerevan in the early 90s, as I have, jet fuel was a big issue. Igdir is 30 miles away from Zvartnots, and the border was closed. Now, politically, we say the airport, the border with Turkey was closed in '93. In economic terms, the border was never open. You find very little statistics, and the Turkish statistical agency, Turkstat, has exceptional data. You have zero exports to Armenia. Okay. So essentially, Armenia was blockaded both in terms of the economics vis-a-vis its traditional partners, but also was blockaded from the east by Turkey, east by Azerbaijan, from the west by Turkey, from the south by Iran because of the terrain, because there was no infrastructure, so you couldn't trade much. And then Georgia has its own civil war, so you had the blockade with Georgia. And these blockades continue. Georgia had a war with Russia. Russia closed the border with Georgia, but by doing so, it ended up blockading Armenia. So nothing could be shipped from Armenia to Russia, except that you ship it to Georgia, then it gets transferred by train to the Black Sea, then it puts on barges and shipped up to Russia, and then shipped back by trains. So you can see the transportation costs and all that. So the difficulties are horrendous. You have the global crisis, you have regional crises, geopolitical, where the US levies sanctions on Russia, the Russian economy suffers, then Armenian migrant workers suffer. But not all these shocks are external. Some of them are self-imposed. If you go back to the 90s, the government did its best to preempt privatization, so no foreign investment. And the data would verify that. The second thing that the government did, it preempted the economic integration of the diaspora. We're not talking about a few millionaires or billionaires providing aid to Armenia or working with them, but also there's this issue of what do you do with the hundreds of thousands of Armenians who could potentially move to Armenia? Or at the least, they do visit, right? So some of them may end up staying. Essentially, the property rights did not exist, economic rights didn't exist, you couldn't buy a house, you couldn't start a business. No, you could, and the way you would do it is you get somebody local, you give them some money, they buy the house in their name, and guess what? A few years later, you couldn't claim the property back because it was registered in somebody else's name. So you can go on and on. So the government essentially kept the private foreign investors out in the 90s, but also kept the diaspora out. Now, this isolation didn't just end in the 1990s. You still have current isolation today. You have a good chunk of the population that works in Russia. And as I would show you later, they essentially are not going to places where the technical skills are cherished or where they'll expand the views of the world. They go and do manual labor. They do not really, they have no exposure to any thoughts, Western or otherwise. And also, you look at some universities, the students, of course, with the exception of the American University, have little exposure to outside, they have very little interaction with foreigners, I would say. And the biggest issue, and I think some people have addressed this before, there's very lack of investment in education. Not only by the government, I mean, the government has limited resources. I think they spend about $600 million today, and that covers everything from elementary to secondary to universities and all that. But even the international organization, it's not part of their objective goal to essentially to fund education. They do, but it's not. It's not the primary goal okay. So today I will just briefly review the economic performance, look at the economy, how it developed, look at migration patterns, look at the demographic imbalance. A lot of us think the demographic imbalance, we're talking about abortions, more boys and girls. As I'll show you later, it's the other way around. We have an existing imbalance. There are far, far more women than men, and that could be creating a lot of issues. And talk a little bit about the state of foreign investment and remittances and so forth, which give Russia a very prominent role in the developing economy. And then follow up with some concluding comments. Now, most of you have seen this picture, not a pretty picture on GDP growth in Armenia. If you look at the early years, you have total collapse of the economy. So now you could attribute this to the fact that Armenia lost its traditional trading partners, but also for those of you who lived in Yerevan in the early 90s, at some point you had no electricity. So it wasn't just that your trading partners were gone, that the infrastructure is no longer able to support a reasonable lifestyle. You had no electricity, no running water. You can go on and on and on. And you have the blockade, so you couldn't trade up north with your traditional partners, but you couldn't go west because Turkey was blocking your way. And you couldn't go south, again, because of the terrain and the situation in Iran. Things got a little bit better, and then you end up with the Asian crisis, financial crisis. Then in the late 1998, you had the Russian crisis, where the oil prices collapsed and the Russian economy collapsed. Things got better till you end up with the global financial crisis, and then the economy tanks. Things get a little bit better, then the Russian economy suffers, then we have sanctions on Russia, and you can see how external factors could really be impacting, I should have done this before, what's going on in Armenia. So a lot of things happen in Armenia that are beyond the control of the government. The biggest issue, the biggest concern I think most of us worry is this reversal where Armenia was known to be a highly industrial economy, turning it into a highly agrarian economy. So essentially, we turned into a nation of farmers. So about 35% of the labor force is in agriculture. This is in 2015. It was a little bit higher, but I presume it's the migration, it's the migrant workers or these farmers leaving and moving to Russia for the summer, coming back, might be making this number higher. But again, this is sizable. So you have 379,000 people engaged in agriculture. Now, these aren't big farmers. Often these people have small houses with small plot of land, and essentially it's more or less subsistence. If you take the 370,000 workers, add a few kids and a wife and so forth, you can end up with a sizable number of the population that is living on subsistence. Okay. These are the people who, because of their economic needs and so forth, these aren't at the forefront of what some people would want to talk about freedom and liberty and all that. These people are really struggling to put food on the table for their family. Okay. Of course, this always comes up. Things get tough. What do? Well, we know we have about 20 million people every year slushing around the world. These are immigrants, refugees, whatever you want to call them, moving east, west, anyway to get a better life for their kids. And Armenia is not an exception. If you look in the early 90s, you have, these are figures to look at the net departures from the country, net of arrivals. And you can see this massive collapse. It's about 250,000 in 92. More people leaving the country than coming back. This is, the early data was only for air transport. The red one I have here is for total, includes land and rail, but mostly it's land and air. And you can see that things got better by the mid-2000s. And then with the financial crisis, things got worse. So we have about 40,000 or so on net people leaving. The interesting thing about these numbers, and I think maybe some more work needs to be done, that the net people leaving the country has declined when you look at air only. So fewer people leave than arrive by air, which tells us that they're leaving by land, and that's a bit complicated. So one thought would be perhaps it's cheaper to go to Tbilisi in Georgia and fly from there, but again, I think this is definitely requires more work. Another aspect of this that should be of interest, remember I said earlier you preempted the diaspora? So much of the economy was destroyed in 90. All the industries are gone, the educational system essentially suffered considerably or degraded. So essentially if you're in diaspora, why would you go and live there, right? I mean, you have no job, no education, and so forth. Now, you could move forward and you can say, well, things got better, why not move now? Well, things didn't get better because you still are in rebuilding mode. And if you look at the net people, I don't know, let's pick 2015. How many people left Armenia? And what is the net number, leaving, coming back? The countries that come to mind in terms of the diaspora say, okay, how many Russians or Armenians from Russia? I don't know really the ethnicity of these individuals. We only know citizenship, the passport, but we can guess more or less where the diaspora would be. So if you look from Georgia, it's consistently more people are coming from Georgia than leaving. But again, the number is small, and that's fluid. It's just next door. If we look at Iran, we have about 700 people on average, more people come into Armenia and leaving, but these may not be Armenians, they could be just Iranians. If you walk down the street of Yerevan, you would see all the signs in Farsi. We look at Iraq. Yeah, I mean, the numbers vary all over the place, but again, it's tiny. People who come and stay, more people who come and stay. Lebanon, it's consistently positive, but it's again, about 300 more Lebanese come and stay than leave. Syria, the big number, and again, it's not. They add up over time, but you're looking at 1,000 or 2,000 Syrians staying then leaving. So clearly, I should say clearly, one would guess that things would have been different in 91 had the economic integration of the diaspora been made possible. Very simple. You had factories that worked. You had an outstanding educational system. Those are gone. Maybe I'm exaggerating. They're not gone, but they're much, much weaker. And so essentially, you don't have this replenishment that one would hope for. I'll give you an example. Israel. Israel is a good example because I'll give you one number. In the 1948 or so, this period, 1948 to 1960, I had to download this from an old blog I'd written, but you had about 800,000 people living in Israel. You had the problems in Egypt in 56, what, with naturalization and all that. A lot of Jews left. You had problems in Hungary and the Czech Republic in 1956. About 870,000 Jews migrated to Israel in this period. And in 1956, or in this period, Israel was not a panacea, was not really, as well off today. It was a rough place. But people went. And one reason they went, because they were allowed to go. They had the opportunity to go. It didn't matter what their social status was, their nationality, their citizenship, they were let in. We're in a different place. I mean, I can go on with this, but eventually this paper will be made available. Often, when we talk about migration and all that, we don't really pay attention on what else is going on. And one of the things that often distracts us is the demographics. We don't really know who's leaving generally. We can guess, and more recent data tells us, but we don't really know much about who left earlier. Well, one figure that has become a hot button issue is the demographic imbalance. And the story, aside from the ethical and moral issues, while we're having more abortions, we have fewer girls than boys. Every year we're losing about 1,500 girls. By 2016, there'll be fewer 60,000, 70,000 boys, and that's a big catastrophe for Armenia. Well, there are far more boys for women now than there are girls. I mean, boys, I'm sorry. If you look at the numbers, let me see, where's, okay. If you look at the country as a whole, for every 100 women, there are 85 men. 85 men. And the numbers get worse as you get older. Okay? So I'm not saying the country is awash with women, but I don't know if there are any sociologists here, but it doesn't take much to guess what would happen when you have few Armenian men, focuses on not just few, but only Armenian, chasing too many women. I can imagine, but two, also given the economic deprivations of the place, I can expand on that, and you can tell a lot of stories. Again, I'm not a sociologist, and it's not my place to tell that. And that can't be healthy for an economy. And when you have too much of a good thing, what happens? You get paid less. Again, I'm guessing. It's not my nature as an economist to guess. We're supposed to be data-driven, analytical, and all that. There's a paper behind this that will come out in the Armenian Journal of Economics. It's an old data, but women get paid less than men. Now, you can say that's universal, but a scientist Armenian shouldn't be getting paid less than a scientist Armenian women. But it does happen, and it does happen at every education level. From those who have the least education to the less high education, you can see over and over and over women get paid less and less and less and less. The question is this because we're men and we're Armenian? That could be it, or is it just things have changed? This is beyond my expertise, but these are some of the symptoms we see. So we've done a lot to keep the men out, the diaspora out. We have the out-migration that's not being replenished, but we're also keeping the foreign investors out. If you look at the early 90s, nothing's happening. No foreign investment. So in my meetings, in one of the meetings, and people, we shouldn't attribute any malice to this. Often if you're a government official, you would say, these are hard times. If I were to sell these businesses and privatize them, I will sell them dirt cheap. Why not wait for a better time? And the question is, well, would better times ever come back? And if they don't, what happens? Your industry turns into dust. Your factories close down. Your supply chains disappear. Your customers disappear. Your workers leave. And essentially, you end up with a situation where the lack of privatization, lack of foreign investment is self-enforcing. The spike you see here is primarily because of Armatel, the Greek company, buying the Armenian. So in the 90s and the early 20s and 2000s, the Greeks were the people often accused of destroying the Armenian economy and monopolizing, because they monopolized the telephone company. Now the complaint is, well, the Russians are doing it, and go on and on. Anyway, so the point is that we had very little investment. So the question is, if you want transition, and if you don't let people in to be the catalyst, how do you end up with a transition? You don't let the diaspora in, you don't let foreign investors in, you isolate yourself. And I know this probably is different from the story that Dean wanted to tell, but that's a subject for a different discussion. But essentially, had policies that kept all these potential catalysts out. So investment did go up, as the previous chart shows, but it did very little. If you look today at the stock of foreign investment in the country, it's about $3.8 billion. Okay? That's what total investment is. So it's not the total cumulative investment, it's cumulative investment less any depreciation, wear and tear, and so forth. So, I mean, for a country of 3 million, this is very tiny. If we look at much of the investment in the early 90s, Greece was the top. They were the first, they came in to buy the telephone company, they were the first to invest in the banking sector, and so forth. Russia didn't come in till later on. And mostly Russia came in the 2005, 2006, as they started acquiring some of the telephone companies. But overall, they account for less than half of the capital stock. But again, it's very tiny. So essentially, if I were to look at it in terms of foreign investment, it's small and not adequate. So remember the theme earlier in terms of the transition and the catalyst. One key question is that, well, one way you can get interaction is by working overseas. Working overseas for Armenians means you're in a country, you hop on a plane, and you fly, you get chartered to places in Russia, you work for 4 or 5 months, you make about $10,000, you come back home. Question is, what are you doing and where are you going? So this is a chart prepared about 10 years ago. For those of you who work in aerospace and you have better data, so one thing I would do in the past, I would go to Zvartnots Airport website, which is the Mink AM, but they've changed it. And you could actually get the schedule of flights 2 weeks in advance. So I would go every year and I would grab these and figure out where people fly. And the advantage of this is that you don't just see if people go to Moscow, because essentially a lot of flights that go to all these areas go to Moscow and then connect. But anyway, so unfortunately, Zvartnots doesn't have this anymore. And so anyway, so if you have any thoughts on this, I would be grateful. If you can see from this map, I don't know how many of you are from this part of the world, once you move from the east, right, you're in central Russia. This is pure manual worker. So people go, work their tail off, make their $10,000, come back home, and feed their family, and then a few months later, guess what? They keep on doing this over and over. Most of the villages are empty because the men are typically working in these areas. And these people are going to come back, and essentially they're going to really promote democracy and freedom and so forth. So it's a tough call. Okay, so what do? They send money back home. So the red line is what money gets transferred from Russia. This is monthly. Monthly by itself isn't very useful. The only reason I share the monthly information with you is because you can see the spikes. You see when people are working and when the money comes back. Okay? And it's mostly the summer times, as you could see. And it's consistent. It's also consistent with geopolitical concerns and global crises, right? The 2009 crisis, the sanctions on Russia, and so forth. Another picture which could tell us a little bit more, convert this to annual data. And one thing you would see at times, and you would scratch your head, why would this be true? That these are net remittances. So essentially looking at money that comes into Armenia, less money that goes out of Armenia. And at times you can see what comes from Russia on a net basis exceeds the total. So Armenia gets close to, let's say 2016, got about $600 million in net remittances, about $700 million left the country. So gross remittances are about 1.3, 1.4. Again, I haven't done research on this, but there's this question, money is coming in, but a lot of money is going out. It's not going out to Russia. Armenia gets little money from the US, and often that whatever money gets from the US is a negative. Essentially, more money comes to the US than goes. So, I mean, it's interesting, but it's a useful source of funds, obviously, if you're poor, but again, it tells you something about the political crises and not the political, external shocks, as well as the growing need of remittances as more Armenians travel. I don't know how much time I have here. The question is, where do we go from here? I mentioned earlier about the works of Professor Ovanesyan and others in terms of research and all that. One key area it stands is investment education. With the exception of the American University of Armenia, there's very little potential in the area of economics and finance. None, they don't exist. No research is being done, nothing is being published. Again, there are a lot of publications, but essentially we're talking about academic publications that stand up to scrutiny and peer review and so forth. They don't exist. And so one area is to increase spending on education. This need not come from the government. The government, I'm sure, probably cannot spend more. But again, the idea is that this needs to be done. Other areas don't require any spending. So essentially, a lot of international organizations have stopped funding on economic development and all that, have moved all the way to spend money on social society, on civil society and democracy and all that. And they've been doing this for a long time. And I think if they had a better way of doing it, I think they would have discovered it by now. And my thinking is that why not spend this on the universities? Why not have the universities as the incubators of democracy and civil society and so forth? You have 10,000 students graduate every year. That's 250,000 students that have graduated since independence. What are they doing? What are they employed? What are they contributing to society? Could they, with the exception of those who've done some of the technical work and all that in terms of sciences and all that, I have no idea. Okay. The other area is that often government, international organizations spend a lot of money on reforms. Tax reform, investment reform, they spend tens of millions, 20 million, 50 million, and they set aside a portion of these funds for education. You know what that means? That means the private entity that's doing the consulting work will set up some conferences at a hotel where they present their work or produce some pamphlets. And I'm thinking, I don't know, this could be hundreds of thousands or millions. Why not spend these at the universities? So we look at Armenia. There's not a single professor, Professor, correct me, we do not have a single professor who has a PhD in finance working full-time in the country. I could be wrong. We do not have a person, I know this for a fact, we talk about government administration, public administration. There's not a single person at the government's Public Administration Academy that have a single professor who is trained in public administration. None. We do not have a single economist in Armenia who is an expert on transportation economics. Okay. I could go on and on and on. And the question is, you know, the funds are there. Why aren't they really being directed into this area? The last area I want to add, this could include the diaspora and not just, you have to do more research. You can't really simply have policies that are not driven by data. You can't go on and say, yeah, I know, Kidem. We've said this many times. The research does not exist. Many of you are scientists. You can go to your journals. You can find all the work you've done, whether you're in civil engineering or electrical and so forth. You have your journals, your publications. Show me how many you see on Armenia. They don't exist. Okay, let me stop. Thank you.
Well, there are some tough questions there, some fascinating trends. Please keep those in mind for the panel discussion afterwards. We've had two very interesting presentations, and now I'd like to move to the third one. Dr. Tatul Manserian, who was born in Yerevan and graduated with an economics degree from Kiev State University in 1984. He's a professor, doctor of economics, and author of 10 monographs and more than 500 scientific articles. And since 1983, he's been teaching in universities in Armenia and abroad. He has many accomplishments in industry and government, which you can read about in the pamphlets that you've been provided. Here I will draw your attention to his more recent experiences. He's been an advisor and head of international organizations in the Republic of Armenia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, head of the International Division in the Emergency Department, scientific director of the Center for Strategic and National Studies in the early 2002-3 period. In 2003, he founded the Alternative Research Center. In 2004, he was elected to the National Assembly from the proportional list of the Justice Alliance, and he has served on the National Assembly's Standing Committee on Financial Credit, Budgetary, and Economic Affairs, and he's the founder of Alternative Research Center. I'd like to invite him up to present Utilizing National Competitive Advantages, Challenges, and Priorities.
Before I start the presentation, I want to say hello to everyone, and I want to break the rule. I want to talk in Armenian, say a few words. Բարև բոլորին, եւ կարծում եմ, որ ճիշտ կլինի, որ այս դահլիճում հայերենը հնչի, Հայաստանի պետական լեզուն, ես Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունից եմ գալի եւ հակառակը սխալ կլիներ։ Ուզում եմ ողջունել Հայաստանի Հանրապետության գլխավոր հյուպատոսին, հյուպատոսի տեղակալին, դեսպան Մկրտումյանին։ Պարոն Մկրտումյան, ես ուրախ եմ, որ Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունը ներկայացված է այստեղի դեմս ձեզ եւ հուսով եմ, որ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության համար շատ կարեւոր նշանակություն ունեցող Կալիֆոռնիայի հայ համայնքը այս տարիների ընթացքում կկարողանա իր լուրջ ներդրումը բերել Հայաստանի տնտեսության զարգացման գործին։ Շատ ուրախ եմ տեսնել Միրան Աղբաբյանին, որի հրավերով պատիվ եմ ունեցել 1996 թվականին գնալ Հայաստանի Հանրապետություն, երբ դասավանդում էի Redlands-ի համալսարանում, դասավանդելու այնտեղ եւ նորից վերադառնալու, եւ այդ տարիներին առիթ եղավ խոսելու եւ հանդիպելու եւ աշխատելու պարոն Հակոբ Փանոսյանի հետ, բառացիորեն առաջին գործարար ֆորումը Սփյուռքում, արտերկրում, Միացյալ Նահանգներում կազմակերպելու համար։ Ես ինքս ներկա չեմ եղել, բայց առաջի գլխավոր հյուպատոս Արմեն Բայբուրցյանը այստեղ հայ համայնքի հետ կարողացավ առաջի քայլերն անել մոբիլիզացնելու։ Ողջունում եմ պարոն Ռիչարդ Հովհաննիսյանին, որի հետ 1991 թվականին փետրվար ամսին պատիվ եմ ունեցել հանդիպելու, հետո իր որդու հետ Ռաֆի Հովհաննիսյանի հետ աշխատել եմ 2002 թվականին, բոլոր իմ ընկերներին, պարոն Հարութ Բրոնոզյանին, Մարկ Շենյան, Արա Խանջյան, բոլորին, եթե ես որևէ մեկի անունը մոռացա, պետք է ինձ ներեք, հիմա անցնեմ բուն նյութին։ Before I start, I want to also tell you that I changed several times the presentation. I'm never satisfied with what I do, and the last minute presentation may contain some errors, so excuse me for that. Utilizing national competitive advantages, challenges, and priorities. The purpose is to examine national competitive advantages of Armenia, considering major challenges and opportunities to utilize them. We investigate the role of the government in a globalized economy under current circumstances, including growing uncertainties, economic threats, as well as new priorities for the nation. We intend to reveal the environment where the state intervenes in the economy to support the implementation of major projects and solve various issues related to the national economic competitiveness. The role of the government. Before examining the role of the government in Armenia, before complaining on different issues, one should consider geo-economic and geopolitical environment of today's Armenia, particularly post-Soviet realities, peculiarities of being a semi-blocked and landlocked country, uncompleted war with unreliable ceasefire agreement, strong dependence on imports and private transfers, poor transportation infrastructure, massive outflow of population, արտագաղթ, and continuous brain drain, contradicting paradigms of economic and political development, numerous local, regional, and global threats and challenges. And not only that. Current realities, challenges of long-lasting transition. I'm grateful to my colleague, David, who presented some of the issues related to long-lasting transition. But one thing I want to mention is that we had the illusion in the beginning that the transition will, if not overnight, then it will be short period of time. And it was called shock therapy. The other version is gradualism, and we didn't have the luxury to choose from these two options. The shock therapy was everything today, the reforming of all economy, not only the economy, but also the institutional values and the whole political system. It didn't happen. After 20 years of independence, after 26 years of independence, we still have shortcomings. And there was a joke about shock therapy. There was a shock, but not therapy. So what shall we do now? Global crisis and the limitations of liberalism. New era of uncertainty. This is something to examine, to study more, because at World Economic Forum of this year, 2017, in January, February, the experts and the heads of the governments paid much attention on the environment of uncertainty that creates more problems. However, it gives us a unique opportunity. King Banayan talked about the Washington Consensus. Fortunately or unfortunately, there is no pressure anymore on post-Soviet countries to choose or to use, although it's a must to use those values. However, countries like Armenia are free to choose their own model for economic development. And to me, the best model for economic development of Armenia will be social market economy. We'll talk about it a bit later. Coordinated efforts of the governments and Armenia, the model of economic development without ideological isms, liberalism, I don't know, communism, etc., to better allocate available resources to improve competitiveness. Competitiveness on macro level, the state level. I don't want to go into details talking about the nature of competitive advantages on a micro level designed by Michael Porter. It's a very important theory followed by the theories that were designed back in 18th century by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, later in 19th century. However, the theory of national competitive advantages justifies our attempt to form a new model for economic development that we may call national, the model for national economic growth. The diamond model is here. As I said, I'm not going to go into details to save your time. Challenges and priorities of national competitive advantages of Armenia. One of the biggest challenge to me is the absence of national agenda. Fortunately, we adopted one 2 years ago. The strategy for development of Armenia for the years 2014-2025. However, the new government pays less attention to that strategy. And we would like to see what will be next. Will the government use the strategy, or design a new one. However, for a long run, we can't try to develop the economy without a national agenda. Privatization and liberalization, those are among the challenges. The principles of Washington Consensus, and 14 governments with a lack of clear vision and clear strategies. The choice of Armenia between EU, European Union, and Eurasian Economic Union. This choice is a bit artificial to me, since the country is free to choose to join any regional bloc. The other reality about Armenia is that in the post-Soviet territory you may come across not one or two, but 5 regional blocs formed, overlapping regional blocs, unlike European Union. And it's a very complicated environment where Armenia needs to complement in foreign economic affairs, not to choose, but to have good relations with all countries. Knowledge-based industries with high value added, including but not limited to IT, biotechnologies, nanotechnologies, energy sector, both traditional and alternative, healthcare services, exports of higher education in medicine, technical and natural science, architecture, music, various segments of tourism, and so on. How about the vision? What is the vision for Armenia's economic development? In general, Armenia's economy may choose from the following: to be a resource-based economy. Competitiveness can be reached by exploring existing resources and utilizing inexpensive production factors. Investment-driven economy, due to immense volumes of investments in locomotive industries. And here I want to mention that a lot of people, a lot of experts, including our colleagues, mentioned foreign direct investments. I think there is a big mistake to don't mention local investments. We never talk about local investments, and without encouraging local investments, why should anyone invest in Armenia? If we don't have our trust toward our economy, if we don't invest in our economy, I call the investments, the foreign direct investments, politicized investments. Look at the economy, look at the structure. David just showed the chart. Russian Federation and other countries, they have political interest. That's why they invest. They take the risk because they are interested in the region. However, local investments have to be encouraged. And last but not least, innovations-driven economy, new technologies and added values for consumers. What are the impacting factors? Liberal investment and trade policies are among the best in among post-Soviet countries. Insufficient FDI and portfolio investments for economic growth. Environment of trust, first to encourage local investments, we just mentioned that, and no agreed approach yet to define national competitive advantages justified by set values, criteria, and principles. We may guess that apricots or, I don't know, construction materials, cognac or other commodities may be considered to be competitive advantages. But where are the criteria that might help us to choose from a variety of products those that are really representing the competitive advantages of Armenia? And while talking about competitive advantages, we can't miss the issues related to economic security. And the role of economic threats, the role of the state cannot be overestimated in fighting economic threats and maintaining sufficient level of economic security, namely food security, energy security, demographic security, as well as financial security, information security, and others. Talking about demographic security, I have to mention that the latest data suggests that In 2016, we had almost balanced number of births and people who left Armenia. It means zero balance. If you add the number of deaths, then we have minus. It's decreasing. The population is decreasing. That's the reality about Armenia. Economic diplomacy. Of course, it's a whole science, and it's impossible to present how economic diplomacy can help Armenia to utilize the competitive advantages. However, we are lacking the concept that can be used, that have to be used to encourage the process of utilizing competitive advantages. And taking into account the fact that one of the most important competitive advantages of Armenia is country's intellectual potential, the economic diplomacy should be directed to the proper presentation of Armenian intellectual resources abroad, providing commercialization of national intellectual resources and technologies, access to international markets through diplomatic agencies and international organizations. Thus, the main purpose is the increased professional assistance to national development and proactive policy. And lately, 2 weeks ago, I had an honor to present the concept of economic diplomacy to the president of Armenia. And in foreign ministry, we have a department headed by a vice or deputy minister of foreign ministry, Robert Haretsyunian, who is heading the department, and we hope that economic diplomacy will be used properly to utilize the competitive advantages of Armenia. Geopolitics and geoeconomics of national competitive advantages. Regional environment, regional actors, and general geopolitics and processes of utilizing national competitive advantages are very important. And we cannot expect, as it was mentioned earlier, we cannot expect the same results, the same outcome from Armenia as we can expect from countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who have totally different environment. And talking about Russia or the role of Russia in Armenian economy, one should mention that the largest source country of investments with almost 65% in 2016, and it's still growing, of all investment totaling almost $3 billion. Economic growth and political developments, trade embargo by Turkey and Azerbaijan, high cargo costs through Georgia. By the way, Georgia is a member of World Trade Organization as Armenia, but violating the principles of WTO in terms of transit costs, etc. Small share of trade with Iran by poor transportation links, bad roads, no railroad yet. Trade turnover with Turkey increases from $40 million in 2000, trade volumes reached to 270 in 2008, then decreased up to 220, 225. Last year, 138 $1 million trade turnover. And tourism is one of the major sectors of exports for Turkey. And Armenia prefers sometimes to visit Turkey for holidays. Lifted sanctions against Iran and gradual liberalization of Iranian economy. We pay less attention, and that's one of the mistakes of experts, to study the factor of Iranian economy and the role of Iran in the region. We all remember a few months ago, it was in the news that an agreement was reached, a preliminary agreement was reached between Russia and Georgia for restarting or restructuring the Abkhazian Railroad. No one mentioned the real players, Iran and Russia. It is really beneficial for not only Russia, Iran, and Georgia, but also for Armenia to have better infrastructure to the rest of the world. Strategically important corridor for entering foreign markets through the ports of Persian Gulf. Iran Eurasian Economic Union integration through Armenia. The influencing factors are bilateral relations, multilateral relations with Eurasian Economic Union, and also Armenia is the only Eurasian Economic Union member country that borders directly with Iran. Armenia initiated a free trade zone between Iran and Eurasian Economic Union countries. International trade and industrial exhibitions are more frequent in starting last year, 2016. 4 exhibitions were held in Iran and in Armenia. North-South corridor will enable Megri to connect with Georgia's Black Sea ports to different countries of the world, and also other opportunities. I'm not going to stop on all of them. But the real expectations are the free trade zone, the hydroelectric power station on Arax River, North-South corridor, a railway, oil refinery, oil product pipeline, the 3rd high voltage transmission line between Armenia and Iran, Megri hydropower plant, and others. Just to give you some figures, the trade turnover for the next 5 years, it's our estimate that could grow at least from $2 billion US dollars. Armenian GDP could double, and Iran GDP could grow from 450 billion US dollars to 500 billion. Especially given the possibility of an exit of Iranian products to the markets of Eurasian Economic Union. And under these conditions, Iran could become the 4th partner, from the 4th partner, the 2nd largest after Russia partner for Armenia. Talking about the regional players, Georgia is one of the key players, especially for Armenia. You can see the opportunities and disadvantages dealing with Georgia and the expectations. Talking about diaspora, I know that we have other colleagues that will concentrate on those issues. However, I would like to mention that one of the major ingredients of success is the Armenian diaspora that plays important role in bilateral relations with Iran, as well as in strengthening links of cooperation with Eurasian Economic Union, the European Union, the United States, and the Middle East for multilateral cooperation and access to the markets of 3rd countries. In addition, geopolitical and geoeconomic environment may also be favorable for utilizing national competitive advantages depending on the role of diaspora in neighboring countries and key players in the region. And diaspora, of course, is viewed as an unexplored national competitive advantages, especially the professional potential, intellectual potential of Armenian diaspora. Some results of experience of utilizing the diaspora's potential in other countries. Most edifying are the cases of Indian, Chinese, Israeli, Italian, Irish, Mexican economic reforms and rapid developments in terms of formation of the national economy and the utilization of its competitive advantages. Now, there are, of course, a lot of obstacles to utilize the potential of Armenian diaspora. In conclusion, I would like to mention that the role of the state in utilizing national competitive advantages cannot be improved overnight. It is a time and energy consuming process, presuming close cooperation of local and external actors, partnership between the public, private sectors, and the professional niche of the civil society. One thing that is important to note, the transition from centrally planned economy to a market economy is also transition from an overestimated role or exaggerated role of the state, of the government, to an underestimated role of the government, which usually is true for liberal economies, free market economies. However, for countries like Armenia, the government have specific role to complete the transition, to design or to help to design a strategy for further development, and to assist in utilizing national competitive advantages. If there are questions, I'm ready to answer, but one thing I want to mention is that we usually talk about two Armenias: virtual Armenia and real Armenia with its challenges, with realities. We need to learn more about the real Armenia. Also, among major challenges, I want to mention that throughout 26 years, there is no civil society yet formed in Armenia to form an efficient government responsible for its actions, or to make the government workable and responsible. From the other side, none of the 14 governments in Armenia designed a strategy to utilize professional potential of Armenian people in homeland and in diaspora. And among the keys to success, one should also pay attention. One of the major things is to stop mass migration, արտագաղթ, and the brain drain. Create a new model for economic development considering war conditions. This is important. We talk about Armenia as if Armenia is in peaceful environment. It is not. The war is still there. Killing our soldiers means the war is still there. It's going on. I'm currently working at a concept called economics of war, what Armenia should do, what model we should choose or design to further grow our economy within that environment. Form an independent structure coordinating actions to better utilize competitive advantages of Armenia and diaspora. And of course, there are some suggestions, but we will talk about it later when there will be questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'll take some questions in the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Mansarian. Some more food for thought. And we have two discussants who will give us their reactions to these three papers before we have the panel discussion. I'd like to invite Ara Khanjan, who's professor of economics at Ventura College, not too far from here, if he'd like to give us his initial thoughts. Thank you, Dr. Khanjan.
It is difficult to discuss three papers in just 7-8 minutes. Therefore, I will just make few comments about each paper. Banayan's article is a good explanation of Armenia's interdependent economic development with its neighboring countries. It seems to me that if Banayan, besides using concepts of borderland, selectorate, and Olson's theory, if Banayan uses also Acemoglu's and Robinson's ideas, his article would be improved. Acemoglu and Robinson basically argue that to have a sustainable economic growth and prosperity, inclusive economic and political institutions are necessary. Inclusive political institutions imply both a broad distribution of political power and limits to that power. It implies that there is rule of law in the country and there are no privileged small number of people who are above the law. Inclusive economic institutions imply competitive markets with property rights, contract enforcement, ease of starting new companies, etc. And without extreme unequal distribution and arbitrary taxation. It should be easy to include Acemoglu's and Robinson's ideas in Banayan's article because Banayan already addresses issues related with inequality and market power. Armenia has some extractive political and economic institutions and has some inclusive institutions. The challenge is to support and promote inclusive political and economic institutions. Manaserian discusses the importance of competition. In order to have competitive advantage in an economic sector, the price in that sector should be relatively low. Monopolies lower production and raise prices. Therefore, to have lower prices and competitive advantage, it is essential to have competition in that sector. Unfortunately, in Armenia, in many economic sectors, few large suppliers control the market. Therefore, when we discuss competitive advantages of Armenia, we need to address the issue of monopolistic power in Armenia. 1 year ago, Prime Minister Hovig Abrahamian's government decided to deal with the problem of monopolies in Armenia. 3 possibilities were discussed. First, increase the power of the state regulatory agency that develops and implements antitrust laws, which promote competition and prevents monopolistic behavior. Second possibility was to expand the jurisdiction of Public Services Regulatory Agency, which regulates prices of electricity, gas, water, etc., and let this agency regulate also the prices of certain essential products. Basically, this option allows monopolists to exist and allows this regulatory agency to monitor prices and prevent monopolists from charging unjustified high prices. Third option was that the government should take measures to make sure that new potential sellers and producers are able to enter the market and increase competition. It seems to me that the government adopted the third option. Manaserian's paper examines competitive advantages of Armenia. I would like to focus on 3 factors that affect competitive advantages, which are exchange rates, real wages, and labor productivity. First, exchange rates. Currency appreciation, or when dram gains value relative to foreign currencies, such as US dollar or ruble, Armenian products become more expensive in the world market and lose competitiveness. Since around 2000, Armenian dram had the tendency to appreciate, except during winter of 2009, or to depreciate at a slower rate than its trading partners. Some argue that Armenian authorities prefer a strong dram, which makes Armenian imports cheaper and exports more expensive, hurting Armenian exporters and helping Armenian importers. With respect to wages and competitiveness, ultimately our national goal should be to increase real wages and allow Armenian masses to consume more, increasing their standard of living and reducing poverty rates. However, higher wages adjusted for inflation could raise cost of production and prices, making Armenian products less competitive. In order to offset the negative effect of higher wages on cost of production, it is essential to increase labor productivity, which equals to total production divided by the number of or units of labor. When workers become more productive and at the same time and the same number of workers produce more than before, then cost of production goes down, which could allow wages to go up and at the same time could reduce prices, making Armenian products more competitive. This implies that it is essential to improve productivity of labor. Productivity could be improved by allocating more funds for education, research, and science and technology that Manasserian and Julfayan discussed at the end of their papers. Improving this infrastructure of the country, such as telecommunication, transportation networks, etc., and improving institutions such as legal and financial are also essential for increasing productivity. Manasserian emphasizes the role of government agencies and the diaspora in promoting exports of goods that Armenia has competitive advantages, and also attracting foreign direct investment. I would like to mention that the Development Foundation of Armenia, DFA, was created to address these needs. However, I agree with Manasserian that there is lots of room for improvement in this area. Finally, a short additional comment on Julfayan's paper, which is full of fascinating and relevant data. Twice the paper mentions that after 2013, Russia's economy experienced drastic drop, quote, following the Western sanctions imposed on Russia, end of quote. It seems to me that the drastic drop of oil prices in 2014 from above $100 a barrel to below $50 a barrel might have caused as much or greater damage to Russia's economy than the economic sanctions. Basically, along economic sanctions, I would suggest to add the drop of oil prices as the cause of Russia's economic slowdown after 2013. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'd like to invite Mark Chenyan to come onto the stage, our second discussant, a founding member of ARPA, and an independent commentator and lecturer. Mark Chenyan, give us your thoughts, please.
Thank you. As I was preparing myself for the last 4 months towards this conference, I did take the time to review the literature, authoritative literature of economics of countries and what was relevant to Armenia. I will not refer to the actual papers simply because Dr. Khanjan already did it. So let me attempt to complement it. I will concentrate on 3 areas: the culture of indigenous capital formation in Armenia, which is non-existent. I will address some problems in the higher education specifically, and I will complement the economic diplomacy portion, which was discussed, and what practically can be done in that direction. So let me go to the culture of indigenous capital formation. One of the areas that is actually missing in Armenia is indigenous capital formation culture. As one of the papers discussed, there isn't too much of investment happening by the people of Armenia, who in a lot of ways, we do see some numbers as far as net worth and so forth is concerned, but zero interest in investing in the country except for some trade and so forth. That has to change. And without that culture being formed, I don't think that we're going to be able, just through foreign aid or outside investments and so forth, will make a difference. For example, the first paper today, which covered the IT area, there's a lot of investments to be done there. And I think that it's our challenge, instead of people who today have the capital, who some people call it the elite, or whatever reason is, as far as I'm concerned, they're the ones who have the capital, and therefore it's our challenge to make capitalists out of them by showing them the way or the ideas in which they were investable, industrial investments, not palace buildings or mansion buildings or church buildings, and redirect that capital into the indigenous economy instead of exporting some of that capital, as you saw some of the numbers out there. So I will stop here, and then later on we may expand on it. In higher education, I do think that the Academy of Sciences in Armenia is a problem. It's a serious problem in our education, and let me explain what I mean by that. The Academy plays two roles in Armenia. One is the prestige part, and the other one, I would, for lack of better explaining it, it's a sort of postdoc kind of education and establishment. I do think that it's an error to deprive, and by definition, Academy of Science is the brightest and the best. I think that it's incorrect to deprive the best that Armenia has in brain power, deprive the students in the universities. And therefore, the way to do it, in my opinion, is divide the Academy of Sciences in two parts, the prestige parts, which we have it here in Europe and so forth, and bring back the postdoc function back into the universities. And that is very, very important as far as quality of education is concerned. It also relates to the second point that I will be making. As it was mentioned today, big amounts of money is needed to improve your education. And it's beyond the means of Armenia. That's virtual versus reality, as we talked about it. And I think that here is a concept that a white paper was written back in 1992 when Velik Harutyunyan happened to be the first Minister of Higher Education, an academician himself. And I don't know what happened to that paper, but let me address it. It basically recommended the sisterhood concept in education, where the sisterhood is not at university to university level, but actually professional school to professional school level. For example, the School of Engineering, School of Law, School of Medicine, Graduate School of Management, and so forth. Create sisterhoods with American universities. And the reason that I'm mentioning American universities, because American universities have ways to get funding from Washington. And that's the only way they can see that we may be able to leverage through American university sisterhoods, but again, the professional schools or to schools. And that way, create some kind of a culture of transfer, both in brain power and quality of education by leveraging American funds through American universities. That's the second point. And third point, the diaspora Armenia. I'm extremely happy and glad that the economic diplomacy concept was put on the table a few minutes ago. We talk about diaspora, Armenia taking advantage of diaspora and so forth. But the problem is this, that have we really quantified what the value of the diaspora is, what the real human resources we have? We don't have it. And therefore, another suggestion that was made back in 1994, again a white paper, was the following. That to have in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and underlying Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Deputy Minister position, whose primary duty through the network of embassies and consulates to create an inventory of the brain power that's available in the diaspora in name, location, and specialization. The easy place to start are the universities. Academics are visible, you can see them, and through them also you can find out who their peers are in the private sector. This kind of inventory has to be put together. And the proper ministry for that is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because physically they're there through their consulates, through their embassies, and so forth. Eventually, once that the inventory is put together and it's available in Armenia, Then the next step goes in, and that is the think tank concept. It's a concept that we do not have it in Armenia, neither over there or here. And I think that with that kind of inventory, you will be able to create the kind of think tanks that we need, where when issues are faced, a lot of thinking goes in it before decisions are made. And therefore, I do think that these three areas I just mentioned are quite practical, in my opinion. It's immediately taking action into these directions and address some of the shortfalls that we have. And then one last thing, we talked about mass migration and drain, power drain, brain drain. I'd like you to think on the following terms, and again, try to quantify it. At one of the conferences that were held by the Economic Association in Washington, D.C. a few years back, and I participated in it. When I walked into that hall at the World Bank, huge hall, a large boardroom table and so forth, and on the wall, I noticed about 20, almost 30 young, good-looking ladies sitting there at an economic conference. The conference started, so I had no time to assess it. As the Q&A portion came up, we were talking, and then the next break, suddenly all these young ladies came over and started talking. Armenian, obviously, but they were talking professional language. A lot of them economics language. And here's how I find out, that there were recent graduates of Armenian universities. They all were in this country doing their PhDs at the best universities that you can think of in America. And the sad part of it is this, and nobody intended to go back. Now, as an economist, here is what I look at. They were all in their mid-20s to later, higher numbers, age-wise, which means, and recently came from Armenia. So let's do a little bit of arithmetic here. For the first 25 or 26 years of their life, Armenian society invested in them. And then because the country doesn't have absorption, they all came here, are doing their PhDs at the best universities, no intention to go back, and when they're going to be productive and also taxpayers, guess who they are paying the taxes to? I think that this kind of thinking has to be indoctrinated in what's happening in Armenia, and a lot of good ideas were put on the table today, and it's time to go and take action. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And is Dr. Zorian still with us? Yes? If he's, Dr. Zorian, would you come join our speakers on the stage? We're going to invite some questions from the audience. And we've just had two discussants who've posed some questions to our speakers. To our speakers, would you like to reply to the discussants, or should we open it up to the audience? Which would you like to do? Would you like to respond? Let me first ask questions. Yes, Cynthia, back there.
Thank you, Carla. A question about the trends that you're seeing. I mean, I was surprised by the trend towards an increased agricultural segment. I was wondering what drives that? Did the diaspora have a role in that? Because I know that there has been a lot of effort and investment from the diaspora into the agricultural sector, and I'm wondering if we influence that. And now I'm seeing that we have a lot of investment into technology, and are we going to see a similar trend into that segment?
Thank you. I think it wasn't that the agriculture increased. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's the industrial base collapsed. So you had factories closing, workers leaving, and so all what you're left are people in the outside Yerevan, essentially, who have a home and a plot of land, and that's basically it. So that's the basic explanation. Yeah, I wouldn't attribute this to the diaspora, but.
I would just add quickly to that of all the countries in transition, land reform came probably earliest to Armenia, so that may have given some increase to the size of the ag sector there versus other countries in transition.
Well, about the agriculture, those countries, post-Soviet countries, that joined World Trade Organization, have common trends. The efficiency dropped dramatically in all those countries. And how to solve those problems? Of course, each country is unique. However, for Armenia, we have a bit more complicated situation because we are in war with Azerbaijan. And when we say mass migration, basically it starts from urbanization, from abandoning the villages around the border. And those villages are given special status since 2 years ago. Free economic zone status. However, we see less investments in those villages, and the government have to promote, have to explain more, not only to the diasporan investors, but also to the world, what advantages that they may have by investing in Armenia. It's also risky to invest in agriculture. The other problem is that current project that is being sponsored from abroad to broaden or to merge the communities, we had 913. Now we expect to have around 200 or something. It further impacts on mass migration. None of the people living in those villages and towns agree to be in that project. No one understands the benefits of it. The disadvantages are much more. So these realities have to be considered when we're talking about agriculture. Also, there are other issues associated to the mentality of farmers who have harvest that exceeds their expectations and they are not able to sell their products in an open market. We have a market economy in Armenia. Better or worse, we have it. And the role of the government in this case is to work with them, not to assist, but to work with them and to give right advice how to proceed. So there are a lot of issues associated with that. One thing to mention, unfortunately, in a strategy designed by the government, the whole sector of agriculture was initially missing. We filled that gap. However, the importance of agriculture or the importance of increasing the efficiency of agriculture is not yet considered. Thank you.
David Gendian. David Asayan, sorry.
All the speakers have approached the topic of the need for internal expansion of the workforce versus the issue with brain drain. It seems to me that certain infrastructure expansions to support that local expansion of the workforce would be needed. what are the different needs as you see them and the pathways to achieving those infrastructure expansions? Some of the ones that I would think of would be healthcare for workers, education, ensuring and safeguarding the securities list that one of the speakers had on one of their slides, as well as physical security and physical infrastructure.
Shall I start? Well, it's a difficult question. However, my personal understanding is that since we're talking about Armenia, and the most obvious competitive advantage of Armenia is the intellectual potential, human capital, the knowledge is not yet demanded in Armenia. I'm not talking about IT. IT is a different story. And I'm really happy that IT is having real progress, not only in Yerevan, by the way, but also in Gyumri, in Vanadzor. And that's also due to the efforts of my colleague, Mrs. Zorian is doing a lot. However, talking about other industries of science, other fields of science, it's not yet demanded. And I appreciate the comments of Mark Shenyan. It's a brilliant idea to reconstruct the whole system of the Academy of Sciences. These guys have zero idea about the commercialization of science or how to deal with young scientists. If we don't take care of young scientists in Armenia, who's going to implement the program for economic development? Old people? Children? No. That's my major concern. We have to stop the mass migration by appreciating the knowledge. As a professor at Yerevan State University, I always ask the ministers of education and science. I say, do you have any data? How many people, how many graduates find their jobs by being educated, by the way, at the expense of the state budget, which is very ridiculous. We spend a lot of money and we don't follow up. We don't care about it. We are donors for developed and some developing countries as well. We don't care about what we waste. And then we say, help us. The human capital, the basic human capital, the intellectual potential have to be appreciated in Armenia. We can't lose young generation. I have been here for a number of years. I used to teach for the University of Redlands. My colleagues here, I'm going to meet them in a couple of days. They call me an example of reverse brain drain, and I'm happy for that. I want to endorse the words of Mark Shenyan, that people who come to America, those who go to Europe, it's excellent, it's very good to improve their knowledge, to get education, to get experience. However, we have to think about our motherland. We can't live like that and come as a tourist to visit. And the major role have to play the government. Thank you.
Are there other questions? Please raise your hand. Yes, Professor Shamassian.
Thank you for all the presentations. Do you know of any quantitative assessment of the degree of rampant corruption in Armenia that is impacting all of the things that you're saying, development, future, new thinking, agriculture, and so on, education? Thank you.
Who would like to tackle that one first?
Yeah, there you go. I would note first the work of the group in Germany, Transparency International, that does a pretty good job of assessing the amount of corruption happening around the world. So it gives you comparative statistics of the degree to which corruption, not just, and usually by interviewing people in the country, trying to assess how often are you asked for a bribe, what is the size of the bribe relative to the size of the benefit you would receive by paying it, and so on. I would make a but there are other studies. The World Bank's been involved in some of this work as well. I don't think there's any work being done specifically to Armenia separate from looking at it in the broader global context. The one point I would make in this is that the model that I'm trying to develop with the work I'm doing, and I want to thank Aura, by the way, for reminding me of Asamoah and Robinson. It's an important piece of work that should be included. Is that those payments, what you and I might look at from the outside and call a bribe. They might look at and say, this is just a way of keeping my political elite together to keep my power in place. And again, if you go back to this rather negative view, it will seem negative to many people in the audience, this view that I have that stationary bandits actually do invest in countries. They unfortunately tax you at too high a rate relative to what democracies will, but they will at least make some of the investments. That not every bribe should be treated as equally bad. There are some places where it actually makes sense to have seen that happen in order to maintain the stability of the government, if it is in fact making the right investments. As we've just heard from David and Tatul, it's not always the case that those investments are being well made. I certainly agree on the education piece, but I just would point out there's data, you could compare that, but I think our ability to understand the purpose of these bribes differs from place to place and really requires us to think carefully about what we call corruption from the outside, what's the context in which it's happening. And it needs to be a little more careful than I think some folks, particularly those of us who live in America and Western Europe, tend to do.
I can add a few more words. Corruption is measured like many other economic measures. In fact, we have this annual global economic report that comes out for Davos. It's a big report. It has dedicated pages about Armenia. If you want, I can show it to you. I have with me the Armenia part. Now, we are in the middle. So last year, 137 countries have been evaluated. So we come somewhere in the middle. We are much better than many other prior Soviet republics in that sense. However, we are very good in certain other aspects, which it's worthwhile to pay attention to. We're very good in starting businesses. We are number one, in fact, in terms of the short step that it takes to start a company, the procedures. We are very good in terms of having the IT support for that company or for anyone, in fact. Cost of internet, we are the number one in that. It's very cheap and available in lots of places. It is worthwhile to look at the report to see in so many categories, I would say 6 or 7 categories at least, we are among the top 5 out of the 137 countries in terms of doing business, ease of business creation, and so on. Of course, we are in the middle in some other aspects as well, and this happens one of them.
One last comment on it. There is a misunderstanding in Armenia that corruption is about bribery only, whereas it's not. I have to mention that choosing wrong people for the government is also corruption. When you choose your nephew, cousin, or a friend to work for the government and to decide the destiny of people there, and you lose the time for a number of years, that's also an expression of corruption to me. The new government of Armenia, I admire them as a team, but when you look at some people in the government with zero background, let me give you some statistic data about the ministers of economy or ministers of finance of Armenia. Almost 80% of them throughout our independence, the years of independence, have no background in economics. What are you expecting from them? And many other examples. I mean, we have to demand or to look for the values, institutions that are not being used in Armenia. While recruiting people you have to look at their background. You can't go to the American University of Armenia with technical background and teach management. But you can do that in some other institutions. These have to be stopped. And this is also corruption. Thank you.
We're going to cut short the discussion for the moment. And I'm going to invite Dr. Panosian onto the stage to say a few words. We do have lunch waiting behind us. Dr. Panosian?
Thank you very much, Carla, for an excellent chairmanship. And thank you for the panelists and the speakers. Now we are going to serve lunch. The lunch is available here. And I forgot to mention one of our other great representatives here, Dr. Armen Dergirelyan is here, the president of American University of Armenia. He actually postponed his trip to Armenia, back to Armenia, just to be here and to be the keynote speaker of the banquet tonight. So all those of you who did not plan to attend the banquet tonight, please change your minds and be with us, join us. And the lunch is ready. And also I'd like to mention again, we are live streaming, and you go to hashtag ARPA Institute, you'll find the link, and please like us and tell your friends. Thank you for coming.
And we will be reconvening at 2:30. That's 2:30. We'll be back at 2:30. Thank you to all of our speakers. We really appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much.